And the time now just coming up to 48.5 minutes past the hour. And time now for our special guest here on Paris Live PM. And today I'm joined by the author of a new book, which is now out in French bookshops. The book is called La France Anglaise, and it takes a look at the English in France and the influence they've had. Well, there's just a short stretch of water, of course, between Britain and France, and over the centuries, English people have visited or settled in France for all sorts of different reasons. Well, historian Diana Cooper-Richet's book focuses on the period from the French Revolution up until today. And Diana, you explain how the English have left their mark in many areas of France, and they continue to do so. You talk about the English occupying parts of France, Normandy, Aquitaine, Anjou, the English kings who chose many of their queens in France. But you really get started, it's from really the revolutionary times onwards, and this famous 18th century grand tour, which of course always began in France, was very popular amongst well-off English people at the time. How did the English view France in those days and the revolution?
I should say that they view it differently depending on the people. There are people who are very favorable to the French Revolution. For instance, Arthur Young, who came to France, he was an agronomist. He came to France to see the rural parts of France, but also to see French industry. He was very charmed by the French countryside. He thought the French aristocrats were very refined, but then he thought that the rural inhabitants were totally abandoned. And then you have people who are totally against the French Revolution, who thought that France was a dangerous country, that the revolution could be contagious. There were people like the philosopher Edmund Burke, who was the most against, I think, among all the English, he was the most against the revolution.
Right. Now, most people who have visited some of the great holiday spots, which are extremely glamorous in France, the Côte d'Azur, the French Riviera, and there are many other areas in France which we think of as very French, very glamorous, and they were actually really made by the Brits. It was the English who went to those areas and made them popular, made them fashionable. How is that the case? Did the French not notice what they had on their doorsteps?
I think that the French didn't have the same view of traveling. French people at that time, beginning of the 19th century, didn't travel much. Right. French people who were well off had their own properties in the countryside. They'd go to their property, they'd go to their chateau, and probably they wouldn't travel that much. British people, English people would tend to go for a better climate. So they'd cross the Channel. They were attracted to France. And people who had lung ailments. For instance, Lord Brougham had a daughter who had tuberculosis, and he was looking for a warm spot for her in the winter.
We're talking about the 1900s now.
No, I'm in
Earlier.
1834 there. He came to France with his daughter, and he stopped in a small village, fisherman's village of Cannes in 1834, and there he decided to settle. And by the time he died in 1868, Cannes had become a very, very fashionable place. And that's how the Riviera started. The Riviera was not only a place where English people went, but it was a place invented by the English.
And who built then these great hotels that we now see in Cannes and Nice and along that stretch in the Riviera? Were they built by...
Some hotels would be built by French people, but they were frequented by English people, obviously. On the other hand, in places like Boulogne and Calais, there were hotels owned by English owners for British travellers, and they felt very much at home when they were in these hotels. And a lot of hotels in France at that period were either called Hôtel d'Angleterre or Hôtel de Londres. There are many, and there are still a lot. If you start looking, as I do, you can see that there are still a lot of them.
That's interesting. And then did the French follow? At what period do the French think the English are onto something here? It's very... It could be a lovely place to holiday down in Cannes or Nice. Or...
It would be later on, I would say. Americans started coming at the end of the century. Then you had Russians, and the French followed. But basically, it was for foreigners to start with.
Right. And when did ordinary English families start visiting France? Because we're talking, first of all, about the very wealthy people who would come before that.
That would be the second half of the 19th century. In fact, it starts with Thomas Cook's organized tours, and the first organized tours for France were in 1855 for the World Exhibit. And there he had tours, 5-day tour for £2 and 5 shillings, something like that. They all slept in the same places. They had special English breakfast with meat, which was unheard of in Paris. And all that was very organized. Ordinary people started to come then. And then they started to come more and more numerous in the second half of the 19th century.
Right, and then, of course, as package holidays came about,
Yes.
they continued to come to France and went further afield to Spain,
Yes,
etc.
they've always come, the British have always come very numerous to France. Of course, there were periods when they stopped coming because it was dangerous for different reasons, but they've always come more and more, and more popular categories of the population came as they came more numerous.
And now, people who haven't visited France might not be aware of it, but there are certain areas in France which have been almost colonised by the British in a colloquial sort of way. Lots and lots and lots of British people settle there. They have created their own little communities. They have English churches. They have English cricket teams. They have settled in large numbers and made their lives in parts of France. I'm thinking particularly of the Dordogne. What triggered that?
They've always, the British have always grouped in colonies. There were colonies around the ports of the Channel, Calais, Boulogne, Dinard, and then there were colonies, of course, in the south of France, but also near the Pyrenees, in Pau. So this is something that's been going on for a long time. They've grouped a lot in Dordogne. It's now called Dordogne sometimes. There are some villages where the population is 30% of English people. You have schools with a great quantity of English children, and the schools are very pleased because otherwise some of the classes would close. And they have their own shops, they have their own clubs, they have their cricket field, they have almost everything. And they sort of rebuild a milieu to which they are familiar.
And so a lot of these areas, they were very, very deserted, very few French people living there. So in a sense, they've injected new life. But have they faced criticism? How sociable are these English people? Do they speak good French? Do they stay amongst themselves? Or are they criticised for creating little separate communities within France?
Sometimes they're criticised, but in many cases, when the villages were starting to be totally deserted, people are very pleased to have these new inhabitants because they've been rebuilding old houses. They've often done it in a very professional way. So in many cases, people are pleased to have the English there. Of course, there are all these cliches, there are all these fixed ideas about foreigners, but I think often enough they can cohabitate quite well, it seems.
So over the years, there's been a fascination amongst the English for France. What is it they admire? What is it they envy?
I think they envy almost everything. They've come to France for the climate. They've come to France for the l'art de vivre, because in the 19th century, life in France was much freer. You can do a lot of things. They used to come for the theatre. They'd come for the food. They'd come for the wine. They now come, I think, basically because they can buy a much nicer house than they could in Britain.
In some of these rural areas of
Yes,
France where
yes.
property is cheaper.
And some places like the Creuse or the Vienne where the property is very cheap, you can really get a nice house, something they could absolutely not afford in Britain. So for that reason, they're attracted to France and still are.
And what do you think the English over the years, over the centuries and now, have brought to France? Some negative things perhaps and some positive, I don't know.
I don't know about the negative things, but there's some things that have been adopted in France, which are definitely English, and things that the British have invented that the French have now sort of recuperated. I'm thinking of clubs. the first clubs were English clubs in France. The Jockey Club was the 1834, and it's the example of what a club can be in England. Horse racing, the British were the first to bring horse racing into France. The haute couture was invented by an Englishman.
Yes, I was fascinated
Frederick
to read
Worth. It's absolutely incredible. And now we have here in France, you have even very good chefs, the British chefs. You have people who are very, very, very qualified in wine tasting, and they're British. So there are all sorts of things, even gardening. I mean, watercolors. The French didn't do watercolors as the English did. So a lot of things have been introduced by the British.
Okay, well, I don't know if you'd be able to classify in one word. What do you think, how would you classify the relationship? What do the English, what the French think of the English?
I think it's very ambivalent. It's difficult to say. Very
and
ambivalent.
we'll get more and more complicated, I suppose,
think, no
with
doubt.
Brexit up ahead. Thank you so much. I was talking to Diana Cooper-Richet. Her book, La France Anglaise, is available in French in France, and perhaps very shortly will be available in English. We hope so. Do join us again at the same time tomorrow. Until then, take very good care of yourselves from me, Angela Diffley. Bye-bye.